I was born into a country that had already lived 1,000 lifetimes. Egypt was ancient when the world was still learning how to name itself. Its temples were older than most gods elsewhere. Its river had watched dynasties rise, rot, and return to dust without ever changing its course. The Nile did not care who ruled. It flowed anyway. And yet, I was born to rule. They called me Cleopatra Philopater, daughter of kings, heir to a throne that no longer fully belonged to those who sat upon it. My blood was not Egyptian by origin. My ancestors came from Macedonia, companions of Alexander the Great, conquerors who stayed and crowned themselves pharaohs. We ruled Egypt, but Egypt was not born of us. That truth followed me like a shadow from my first breath. I grew up in Alexandria, a city that believed it was the mind of the world. Marble streets, salt air, voices speaking a dozen languages at once. Scholars arguing in shaded courtyards while soldiers drilled nearby, reminding everyone that ideas survived only if guarded by steel. The palace was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, polished, sharp, and dangerous to touch without care. From the outside, it appeared stable. From within, it was a chamber of echoes. Every step carried whispers. Every smile concealed a calculation. My family did not gather for love. We gathered for appearances. As a child, I learned early that royalty is a condition, not a comfort. My tutors came before sunrise. Greek philosophy first, Plato, Aristotle, the nature of justice and power. Then Egyptian history, the old dynasties, the gods, the rituals that bound the people to the land. Mathematics, astronomy, law, music, rhetoric. But the most important lessons were not taught aloud. I learned that silence could be an accusation, that hesitation could be interpreted as weakness, that affection was rarely free of obligation. I watched my father, Ptolemy the Thene, navigate his reign like a man balancing on cracking ice. Rome loomed over us, distant yet omnipresent. Senators argued over Egypt's fate as if we were a field to be divided, not a civilization that fed half the Mediterranean with grain. My father paid Rome to stay on his throne. Gold flowed out of Egypt like blood from an open vein. He called it survival. Others called it humiliation. I watched carefully, because I understood something even as a girl. Power borrowed is power that can be reclaimed at any moment. I learned languages not as ornaments, but as weapons. Greek was the tongue of my dynasty, but I spoke Egyptian fluently, the language of the people, of prayers, of markets and farms. I learned Latin to understand Rome without needing an interpreter's mercy. Hebrew, Aramaic, the speech of traders and diplomats. A ruler who cannot speak to her people directly rules only their bodies, not their loyalty. When I walked among Egyptians and spoke their language, I saw something shift in their eyes. Not love, but recognition. I was no longer just another foreign queen behind palace walls. I was a voice that acknowledged them, that frightened certain men in the court. They preferred a queen who smiled silently. The palace itself was alive. It listened. Corridors remembered secrets. Servants noticed patterns. Guards knew which footsteps belonged to confidence and which belonged to fear. I learned to walk slowly, deliberately, as if I had nowhere urgent to go. Even when my heart raced, I watched my siblings closely. In royal families, siblings are not companions. They are probabilities. My brothers were raised as rivals by default. My sisters learned that beauty could be leverage, but also a death sentence. Love was conditional. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. I do not recall a single moment when I believed my childhood would be peaceful. Only purposeful. As I grew older, the court began to look at me differently. Not as a child, not yet as a ruler, but as a variable. Men spoke more, carefully when I entered rooms. Conversations paused, then resumed in altered tones. Advisors began testing my opinions, offering false choices to see which path I favored. I did not answer impulsively. I learned to ask questions instead. A question reveals more than a declaration ever could. Egypt itself was restless. The people remembered older pharaohs who had been gods among men, rulers born of the land, not imported through conquest. My dynasty's legitimacy depended on rituals, ceremonies, and constant reinforcement. Without them, we were merely Greeks wearing Egyptian crowns. Priests held power equal to generals. Temples were not just religious centers, they were economic and political engines. To rule Egypt, one had to understand faith, not as belief, but as structure. I listened to the priests, I respected their rhythms, and they noticed. Rome, meanwhile, tightened its invisible grip. Envoys arrived with polite smiles and precise demands. Loans, treaties, guarantees. Each agreement carved another notch into Egypt's sovereignty. Rome never rushed. It did not need to. Empires are patient when they know time is on their side. I watched my father age under the weight of it all. His voice lost certainty. His decisions grew cautious, sometimes desperate. When riots broke out over taxes, I saw how quickly love could turn to fury when stomachs were empty. A ruler must never forget hunger. I began to understand something essential. Egypt did not need another placeholder monarch. It needed a defender, not a dreamer, not a symbol, a strategist. And I knew, deep in a place untouched by doubt, that I would not survive by being agreeable. When my father died, the palace mourned loudly. But beneath the chants and incense, calculations began immediately. Who would rule? Who would advise? Who would control the crown behind the curtain? I was named co-ruler, bound by tradition to my younger brother. It was presented as continuity, as balance, as necessity. I recognized it for what it was, a leash. Those who stood behind him believed they could guide Egypt through a child's hand. They believed I would fade into ceremony and motherhood, into irrelevance. They mistook my silence for submission. That was their first error. The crown was placed upon my head with ritual precision. Gold pressed against my temples. Heavy, cold, symbolic. I felt no triumph, only resolve. Because I understood something that moment. This throne would either be taken from me, or it would be defended by me. There would be no middle ground. And the Nile flowed on, indifferent, eternal, waiting to see whether I would rise like its flood, or vanish like footprints in its sand. The first days of rule are always theatrical. In Alexandria, grief wore perfume. The palace dressed itself in black linens and solemn faces, and yet beneath the mourning, power moved like a current you could not see, only feel when it pulled at your ankles. My father's body had barely cooled when the court began to rearrange itself around my brother, Ptolemy the Thean, and around the men who spoke for him. They stood close to the boy king as if proximity alone could turn them into kings. On paper, I was his co-ruler. In ritual, I was his equal. In public, we appeared as a balanced pair. Sister and brother joined by dynasty, crowned by tradition, blessed by priests, presented to the people as stability. But inside the palace, stability was a costume, and I could already hear the stitching tearing. I had not grown up believing in luck. I believed in patterns, and the pattern was familiar. A young ruler surrounded by ambitious advisors meant the advisors would rule, and the young ruler would become their seal. If I resisted, they would call me arrogant, unnatural, dangerous. If I yielded, they would call me wise and erase me quietly. A queen does not die only by poison or blade. A queen can be killed by being made irrelevant. The boy beside me wore the crown like a child wearing his father's armor. Heavy, impressive, and ill-fitted. Ptolemy was not cruel by nature. He was young, eager to be admired, uncertain of his own strength. Those around him exploited that uncertainty like merchants exploiting a famine. They fed him pride. They fed him suspicion. They fed him stories where I was the threat. The names of those men became the machinery of my early reign. Courtiers who smiled too widely. Generals who looked at the floor while listening. Officials who spoke of tradition whenever they meant control. They said Egypt needed guidance. They said a woman should not make decisions alone. They said my role was to symbolize the crown, not direct it. I listened without flinching, and then I began to move. In the beginning, I chose my battles carefully. I appeared in public frequently, not in panic, but in presence. I stood at ceremonies with the confidence of someone who belonged there. I spoke to priests in their language. I issued decrees with my name placed boldly where it should be. Names matter. In royal documents, a name is not just identity. It is authority, carved into law. When I signed alone, I was sending a message. The throne did not belong to a boy and his handlers. It belonged to the crown itself, and I wore it too. The court responded with polite outrage. They called it improper. They called it unbalanced. They called it dangerous. I translated those words easily. They meant stop. So, naturally, I did not. A kingdom is not ruled only from a palace. It is ruled through grain, water, coin, and the invisible confidence of the people that tomorrow will arrive with food. Alexandria was glittering, but Egypt was vast and fragile. In the villages along the Nile, farmers did not care about palace etiquette. They cared about flood levels, taxes, corrupt officials, and whether their children would eat. I called for reports, not flattery. I asked how much grain remained in storehouses. I asked what debts were owed to Rome. I asked what temples held in their treasuries and what governors were skimming from their provinces. Each question tightened the room. Because questions are threats to those who thrive on silence. Rome's shadow stretched into every ledger. My father had paid to keep his throne. Now we paid to keep our peace. Egypt's coin did not vanish by accident. It vanished by agreement. Every Roman envoy who arrived with smooth words also arrived with an open hand. And Rome, always, had another promise behind the promise. If you fail to pay, we will help you restore order. That phrase, restore order, was Rome's favorite mask. Under it, they could take whatever they wished and call it duty. I understood that Egypt could not fight Rome directly. Not yet. But we could reduce our vulnerability. We could strengthen our internal control so that when Rome pushed, it met stone instead of sand. That plan required something the palace did not want: a queen who governed. My brother's advisors began separating us. It started gently. They suggested separate councils for efficiency, separate audiences to reduce conflict, separate appearances to calm the people. A clever net woven from politeness. If I was isolated, I could be recast as a problem. A queen alone in a palace is a rumor waiting to be weaponized. They wanted the court to think I was ambitious beyond my station, that I threatened the boy king, that I was disrupting the natural order. They did not understand how I had been raised. In my family, order was never natural. It was forced. I looked for allies, but not in the obvious places. Men in court pledge loyalty easily. Their loyalty is often rented. I sought those whose interests were tied to Egypt itself. Certain priesthoods, administrators who understood that instability meant chaos. merchants who knew that civil conflict destroys trade. I made myself useful. A ruler who is useful becomes difficult to remove. But usefulness is not always enough when your opponents control the boy who wears the crown. The court began to whisper, and the whispers grew legs. They whispered that I was too close to the priests, that I wanted to rule alone, that I planned to exile my brother, that I spoke to Romans in secret, that I would bankrupt Egypt for my own glory. Some accusations contradicted others. That did not matter. The point was not truth. The point was fog, so thick that no one could see clearly enough to oppose the men creating it. I had seen this strategy before. It is the strategy of those who cannot defeat you openly. They surround you with confusion until you cannot breathe. Still, I held my ground. I attended ceremonies as pharaoh. In those moments, I was not merely queen. I was the living bridge between human governance and divine order. Egypt's political imagination was spiritual. A pharaoh was more than a ruler. So I performed the rites precisely. I offered to the gods. I stood before the people not as a Greek princess playing dress-up, but as someone who understood Egypt's sacred continuity. Some Egyptians looked at me with guarded respect. Others looked at me with hope. Hope is dangerous in politics. It makes you responsible for more than promises. It makes you responsible for dreams. And dreams can become fury if betrayed. My brother's advisors sensed the shift. They had expected me to be decorative. Instead, I was becoming a focal point. A rival center of gravity. That is when they began to move faster. They pushed my name off certain documents. They blocked my access to key officials. They intercepted messages. They tried to starve me of information, because information is the first food of power. I countered by creating my own channels, discreet messengers, loyal scribes, contacts in temples and ports. The palace believed it controlled the doors. I reminded myself that Alexandria was a city of 1,000 entrances. Yet even as I outmaneuvered them in small ways, I could feel the larger pressure rising. It was the sensation of standing beneath a dam that is beginning to crack. The breaking point came not as a single dramatic confrontation, but as a series of humiliations arranged to look administrative. A decree issued without my consent. A public appearance scheduled without my knowledge. A council where my seat was moved, slightly but unmistakably, to the side. Insults in palaces are never accidental. They are rehearsals. They were rehearsing the idea that I did not belong at the center. I responded by returning to the center anyway. And that was when I understood. They were no longer merely challenging me. They were preparing to remove me. At night, the palace sounded different. The same corridors, the same torches, the same servants. But the silence carried teeth. I felt watched, even when alone. I measured every cup of wine. I listened for footsteps outside my chambers. I learned to wake from sleep as if pulled by a string. This is what it means to rule inside a court that hates you. You must be sovereign with half your mind and vigilant with the other half. And still, I could not show fear. Fear is a perfume that spreads. Once others smell it, they begin to plan around your fall. So I wore calm like armor. In those days, I thought often of my father, not with tenderness, but with understanding. His reign had been a balancing act between Rome, the priests, the people, and the palace. He had survived by buying time. But time, I realized, was not something you could purchase forever. Eventually, you must pay with something else. One evening, I stood alone on a balcony overlooking the city. Alexandria glittered like scattered coins. Somewhere beyond the lights, the sea waited. Somewhere beyond the sea, Rome waited. And within my own walls, my brother's advisors waited for a moment when I was weak enough to push. I whispered to myself, not a prayer, not a vow, but a truth I needed to hear. If I do not seize my own authority, I will be erased. A queen who waits politely for permission to rule is not a queen. She is an ornament. And ornaments can be discarded. By the end of that year, my name was being pressed out of official life, like ink blotted from parchment. The court had not yet declared war on me, but the air had already turned hostile. The Boy King's council was consolidating control, and I was beginning to understand, with chilling clarity, what my options truly were: submit and vanish, or resist and risk everything. History loves to pretend those choices are dramatic. In reality, they are simply the choices left when everyone else has already decided the game. I turned from the balcony, returned into the palace, and walked its corridor of mirrors, seeing my reflection fractured into a dozen versions of myself. Princess, queen, threat, symbol, survivor. Then I chose the version I would become, not yet publicly, but internally, irrevocably. Because once a ruler makes that choice, the future begins moving, even if the world cannot see it yet. Power rarely announces itself when it decides to strike. It does not arrive with banners or war cries. It arrives as procedure, as protocol, as concern expressed in calm voices. And by the time you realize it is an attack, it has already wrapped itself around your throat. I learned this as my authority began to disappear, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a statue slowly chipped until only a shape remains. At first, it was minor things: invitations that arrived late, meetings that concluded before I entered, decisions explained to me afterward as if they had been unavoidable, regrettable, already done. They smiled while doing it. That was the most dangerous part. The men who controlled my brother understood something essential about palace politics. Open force invites resistance. Quiet removal invites compliance. They did not accuse me publicly. That would have forced debate. They did not arrest me. That would have required justification. Instead, they made my presence seem unnecessary. If I spoke in council, they thanked me and proceeded without reference to my words. If I issued orders, they delayed them until circumstances changed. If I appeared in public, they arranged events where my role was ceremonial, decorative, harmless. They were teaching the court and the city to imagine Egypt without me. That is how coups truly begin. My brother watched all of this with the confusion of youth. I do not blame him for everything that followed. He was too young to understand the scale of the game being played around him. He had been raised to believe the crown was his by right, and that advisors existed to guide him. He did not yet know that advisors often guide only toward their own reflection. They spoke to him of threats. They spoke to him of tradition. They spoke to him of me. They told him I wanted to rule alone, that I was impatient, that I had ambitions unsuited to a woman, unsuited to harmony, unsuited to Egypt's stability. They frame their control as protection, and protection is a story children are taught to trust. I tried to reach him privately. I spoke gently, without accusation. I reminded him that we were bound not just by blood, but by survival. That Rome watched us constantly. That division made us weak. He listened, but his eyes were already elsewhere, trained by others to see me as a complication, not a partner. I saw then that he was no longer fully accessible to me. That realization was colder than anger, because once communication is severed, reconciliation becomes nearly impossible. The city felt the change before it was declared. Officials loyal to me were reassigned. Some were removed entirely. Temples I had supported found their funding delayed. Priests who had welcomed my attention grew cautious, then distant. No one wants to be associated with a losing side, especially when the losing side has not yet been officially labeled as such. I understood that fear was spreading quietly, like ink in water. And still, I remained outwardly calm. In courts, panic is contagious. So is confidence. At night, I reviewed everything I still controlled. My name still appeared on some decrees. I still had personal guards whose loyalty I trusted. I still had influence among certain priesthoods and merchants. I still had public recognition among the people. But power is not a list of possessions. It is momentum. And my momentum was being deliberately slowed. The advisors moved next against my visibility. They claimed that joint appearances were causing confusion, that Egypt needed a single, clear image of authority, that my absence from certain ceremonies would simplify matters. They did not forbid me from appearing. They simply stopped inviting me. When I appeared anyway, the tension was immediate. Guards hesitated. Officials exchanged looks. The audience felt unsettled, not because I was unwelcome, but because my presence disrupted the narrative being constructed. I realized then that the coup was already underway. It just hadn't admitted itself yet. One morning, a decree was issued without my seal. That alone would have been a scandal months earlier. Now it was treated as an administrative oversight. The document concerned taxation, one of the foundations of rule. To remove my authority, there was not symbolic. It was structural. I confronted the council. They responded with rehearsed concern. They spoke of urgency, of efficiency, of the boy king's maturing leadership. They apologized without correcting anything. An apology that changes nothing is not an apology. It is a rehearsal for dismissal. I returned to my chambers with the knowledge settling heavily in my chest. They were not trying to negotiate with me anymore. They were managing me. And management always precedes removal. There is a moment in every ruler's life when illusion collapses. For me, it came quietly, without drama. I was standing in front of a mirror, adjusting ceremonial jewelry, gold shaped into symbols older than my dynasty. I looked at my reflection and saw something unsettling. A queen dressed as a queen, but being treated as a guest in her own reign. I understood then that if I stayed, my authority would continue to shrink until nothing remained but a title without teeth. They would not kill me. They would let me live, irrelevant, ornamental, safely neutralized. And that fate was more dangerous than exile, because it would erase me without resistance. The advisors accelerated their plans. They accused my supporters of disloyalty. They questioned my expenditures. They hinted that Egypt's troubles were linked to my interference. They spoke of order. They spoke of tradition. They spoke of necessity. Those words always appear when injustice wants to look reasonable. Finally, the pressure broke through into action. I was informed, not consulted, that I would be removed from Alexandria, temporarily. That it was for my safety, that tensions were high, that my absence would restore calm. Exile, disguised as courtesy. I was not arrested, I was escorted. That distinction matters. Arrests create martyrs. Escorts create disappearances. As I walked through the palace one last time, I noticed how quickly people adjusted their gaze. Some avoided my eyes. Some looked at me with pity. A few looked at me with something like regret. No one intervened. Courts do not intervene. They observe. Outside the palace walls, Alexandria breathed on, indifferent to the drama inside. Ships moved in the harbor. Merchants argued over prices. Life continued. That too is a lesson rulers must learn. The world does not pause for your fall. I left the city with a small retinue, those few who had chosen loyalty over safety. We moved east, away from the center of power, away from visibility, away from the illusion that this was over. Because exile is not an ending. It is a position. In the desert, the silence was different. No whispers, no corridors, No smiles with hidden edges. Only wind, stars, and time. Some nights doubt tried to speak. It asked whether resistance was worth it, whether Egypt might be safer without me, whether survival itself was enough, even if stripped of power. I listened to those questions carefully, and then I dismissed them, because survival without agency is just delayed defeat. I began to plan, not loudly, not rashly, but deliberately. I contacted allies discreetly. I assessed which governors still remembered their loyalty. I measured how much support I could realistically gather, not for spectacle, but for leverage. I knew I could not reclaim my throne alone. I also knew that Egypt's internal struggle had attracted attention beyond its borders. Rome does not ignore instability. Rome feeds on it. And somewhere within that distant, dangerous empire, there were men who might find advantage in restoring a queen, if it served their interests. That realization did not comfort me. It sharpened me, because I understood the next truth with absolute clarity. If I wanted to return, I would have to do so not just as Cleopatra the exile, but as Cleopatra the necessity. A ruler Rome could not afford to ignore. A queen Egypt could not easily replace. The silent coup had succeeded in removing me from the palace, but it had failed in one critical way. It had not removed my will. And will, once hardened, becomes strategy. As I stood beneath the open sky, far from Alexandria's mirrors and marble, I made a quiet decision. Not dramatic, not spoken aloud, but final. I would return. Not by pleading, not by compromise, but by making myself indispensable to forces larger than those who had pushed me aside. The desert did not answer. The stars did not answer. But somewhere, beyond the horizon, history began to shift. Exile strips away illusions faster than any tutor ever could. In the palace, power had been wrapped in ceremony. In exile, power was reduced to its raw components: loyalty, resources, timing, and will. There were no walls to hide behind, no servants to filter reality, no rituals to reassure the frightened. There was only the question that matters most when everything is taken from you. What remains when the crown is gone? What remained for me was resolve, and a name that still carried weight, even when spoken quietly. We moved through the eastern edges of Egypt, staying just beyond the immediate reach of Alexandria's authority. Each stop was calculated. Too visible, and my enemies would move against me. Too hidden, and my name would fade into rumor. I learned quickly that exile is not passive. It is active, survival. Every conversation mattered. Every meeting carried risk. People who welcomed me into their homes risked their livelihoods, sometimes their lives. They did not do it for affection. They did it because they understood something fundamental. If Egypt fell fully under the control of palace factions, or worse, into Roman administration, the consequences would be permanent. They remembered foreign governors. They remembered what it meant when Egypt's grain became Rome's property instead of Egypt's leverage. I listened more than I spoke. Exile gave me something the palace never had: clarity. Away from flattery and ritual, people spoke honestly. They complained about taxes, corrupt officials, soldiers who took without paying. They feared Rome's appetite. They feared civil war even more. I did not promise miracles. I promised order. A ruler who promises miracles invites disappointment. A ruler who promises order invites endurance. Slowly, I gathered support. Not an army yet, but a framework. Local leaders who still believed in my legitimacy. Priests who remembered my respect for their authority. Merchants who knew stability was good for business. Officers whose loyalty was to Egypt rather than the palace clique currently holding the boy king. Each alliance was fragile. None were guaranteed. Exile teaches you humility not as surrender, but as precision. You learn who can be trusted with information, who only with tasks, who with nothing at all. And you learn something even more valuable: who watches you from afar. Rome watched everything. It always did. At first, Rome's interest in Egypt's internal conflict was distant, almost bored. Civil unrest in client kingdoms was common, but as reports reached Roman ears, grain shipments delayed, factions forming, authority questioned, that boredom sharpened into calculation. Instability is opportunity to an empire, and opportunity attracts men who believe they can shape it. It was during this time that I first heard more detailed whispers of Julius Caesar, not as a distant Roman hero, but as a force moving unpredictably across the Mediterranean. He was fighting his own civil war. Rome was tearing itself apart between ambition and tradition. Caesar had crossed lines that were not supposed to be crossed. He had made enemies who smiled publicly and sharpened knives privately. I did not admire him. I studied him. Because rulers like Caesar do not ask whether they should intervene in a place like Egypt. They ask how much it is worth. I knew I could not reclaim my throne through Egyptian force alone. Any attempt to march on Alexandria without external backing would fail, and justify Rome's direct intervention under the pretext of restoring order. So I reframed the problem. Instead of asking how I could defeat my enemies, I asked how I could make their position untenable. They relied on Rome's indifference. I needed Rome's attention. They believed Egypt was manageable without me. I needed to prove Egypt was unstable without me. Not through chaos, but through uncertainty. From exile, I allowed my name to circulate again. Not loudly, not defiantly, but persistently. I let it be known that Cleopatra still commanded loyalty, that certain governors hesitated to obey orders without my approval, that temples questioned decrees issued without my seal. I did not incite rebellion. I allowed ambiguity. Empires hate ambiguity. It complicates accounting, logistics, and control. Meanwhile, my brother's advisors grew nervous. They had expected exile to silence me. Instead, it had transformed me into a variable they could not predict. Alexandria remained uneasy. Grain shipments were strained. Priests murmured discontent. And Rome began to ask questions. Then fate accelerated everything, as it often does when patience is exhausted. Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. Not as a guest, not as a conqueror, but as a Roman seeking advantage in chaos. He came chasing his enemies, pursuing leverage, following the scent of unresolved power. Alexandria panicked. The advisors around my brother believed they could control the situation by presenting themselves as loyal, cooperative, compliant. They believed Caesar would favor the side already seated on the throne. They misunderstood Caesar's nature. He was not interested in appearances. He was interested in outcomes. When news reached me that Caesar had entered Alexandria, I understood immediately that time had narrowed. Exile had taught me patience, but opportunity demands speed. I could remain where I was and wait to be forgotten, or I could gamble everything on direct engagement with the most dangerous man in the Roman world. There are moments in history when caution becomes more reckless than risk. This was one of them. The decision was not romantic. It was strategic. If I approached Caesar through letters, I would be filtered, delayed, distorted. If I relied on intermediaries, I would be reshaped into whatever story suited them. No, if I was to survive, I had to be seen. Not as a rumor, not as a complaint, but as a ruler. The journey back toward Alexandria was calculated to avoid attention until the last possible moment. I traveled lightly. I discarded excess ceremony. I reduced my retinue to those absolutely necessary. Power does not always travel with spectacle. Sometimes it travels with audacity. As we neared the city, tension pressed against my chest, not fear, but awareness. Every step closer increased the risk. If my enemies intercepted me before I reached Caesar, the story would end quietly. No trial, no declaration, just disappearance. I prepared for that possibility, not emotionally, but practically. A ruler who cannot face death calmly has already lost. Alexandria at night was restless. Caesar's presence had unsettled everything. Roman soldiers moved through streets that had never belonged to them. The palace bristled with anxiety, masked as hospitality. Inside those walls, decisions were being made about Egypt's future without me. I intended to correct that. Getting to Caesar required bypassing every structure designed to exclude me. Guards, protocols, advisors who claimed he was unavailable. I did not argue. I bypassed. History does not remember those who obeyed instructions. When I finally stood before Julius Caesar, I did not kneel. I did not plead. I spoke as one ruler to another. I explained Egypt, not emotionally, but structurally. Its divisions, its value, its fragility. I explained that a divided throne would never deliver stability, and instability would cost Rome far more than alignment. I explained that my enemies could hold the palace, but they could not hold Egypt. And then I waited. Caesar listened, not as a judge, not as a lover, but as a man measuring a tool. In that silence, everything balanced. My life, my crown, Egypt's future. I understood something then, with piercing clarity. Exile had not weakened me, it had prepared me. Because only someone who has lost everything can speak without fear of losing more. When Caesar finally spoke, his questions were precise, sharp, dangerous, and I answered them all. Because exile had taught me the final lesson a ruler must learn. When the moment comes, hesitation is fatal. History often reduces turning points to a single image, a single gesture, a single dramatic breath held in suspense. But the truth is more subtle and more dangerous. The moment that changed my fate was not theatrical. It was quiet, enclosed, and balanced on calculation rather than romance. I stood before Julius Caesar not as a legend, not as a myth, but as a displaced ruler, asking another ruler to see clearly. The room was small by palace standards, guarded but not ostentatious. Roman efficiency stripped away Egyptian excess. No incense, no ceremonial music, no divine symbolism carved into every surface. Just stone, maps, and a man who had learned how to bend chaos to his advantage. Caesar did not rise when I entered. That alone told me much. He was not impressed by titles. He was not intimidated by spectacle. He was accustomed to being the axis around which others moved. So I did not perform. I spoke. I spoke of Egypt's divisions, not as grievances, but as liabilities. I outlined the court factions with the clarity of someone who had lived among them. I explained how my brother's advisors ruled through fear and manipulation rather than legitimacy. I showed how this would inevitably lead to unrest, delayed grain shipments, and rebellion disguised as religious outrage. Rome depended on Egypt's grain. That was the fulcrum. Empires do not move on emotion. They move on supply lines. I did not accuse my enemies directly. I let their incompetence speak through facts, numbers, delays, fractures, probabilities. Caesar listened with his head slightly inclined, eyes steady, expression unreadable. That silence was not indifference. It was evaluation. He asked me why he should trust me. Not whether, but why. I answered honestly. I told him I was not asking for Rome's favor, only Rome's self-interest. That Egypt needed a ruler who could command loyalty without constant Roman supervision. that my return to the throne would stabilize Egypt faster and cheaper than prolonged intervention. I told him I understood Rome's power and Rome's fatigue. Civil war had drained its resources. Caesar needed reliability, not another province to pacify. And then I said the thing most dangerous to say in front of a man like him: that Egypt could not be ruled forever as a dependent shadow. I did not frame it as defiance. I framed it as reality. Caesar's questions sharpened. He asked about my support. He asked about my enemy's strength. He asked what would happen if Rome backed me and failed. I did not overpromise. Overpromising insults intelligent men. I told him what I could deliver: order, continuity, grain, loyalty, if supported decisively. I told him what I could not guarantee: gratitude from Rome's enemies, silence from his critics, or ease. Ruling Egypt was never easy, and Caesar respected difficulty. What people misunderstand about Caesar is this: he did not seek chaos for its own sake. He sought control over chaos. And he recognized instantly that Egypt was already unstable. The only question was who would stabilize it, and on whose terms. My enemies had offered him submission. I offered him competence. Outside that room, Alexandria trembled. Roman soldiers clashed with local forces loyal to the palace faction. Streets filled with rumors. Fires of anxiety spread faster than any flame. The city felt like a held breath that might break into riot at any moment. Inside, the decision approached. Caesar did not announce his choice immediately. He delayed. That delay was deliberate. He wanted to see how the palace would react to uncertainty, how my enemies would behave when Rome hesitated. Who would reveal desperation first? Power always exposes itself under pressure. When Caesar finally acted, it was not through a speech. It was through enforcement. He declared that Egypt's royal dispute would be arbitrated under Roman authority, temporarily. He ordered both sides to submit their claims. He demanded access to records, decrees, finances. The advisors around my brother protested. They called it interference. Rome called it oversight, and oversight always favors the one with soldiers in the room. I was restored. Not fully, not yet, but visibly. My name returned to decrees. My presence returned to councils. The palace, once closed to me, reopened with stiff smiles and tightened jaws. My enemies realized too late that by inviting Rome to stabilize Egypt, they had surrendered control of the process. Rome does not mediate. It decides. The conflict did not vanish overnight. Alexandria descended into tension that felt like siege without formal declaration. Supplies were strained. Loyalties were tested. Every street corner carried the potential for violence. I stayed close to Caesar, not out of sentiment, but strategy. Visibility mattered. Alignment mattered. Absence would invite reinterpretation. The city needed to see that Egypt's future was being negotiated, not stolen. In private moments, Caesar and I spoke further, not just of Egypt, but of Rome, of ambition, of legacy, of how power reshapes those who hold it too long. He was curious about Egypt's gods. I was curious about Rome's laws. Each of us measured the other's mind carefully. Do not mistake this for romance. It was recognition. Two rulers acknowledging that they stood at the edge of history's knife. My brother's advisors began to panic. Their authority relied on exclusivity. Rome's presence dissolved that advantage. Their grip loosened as priests, officials, and generals recalculated their positions. Some switched sides quietly. Others doubled down, making mistakes born of fear. Fear accelerates error. When fighting finally erupted openly within Alexandria, it was chaotic but brief. Roman discipline overwhelmed palace forces that lacked cohesion. The city suffered, not from conquest, but from indecision that had gone on too long. I did not celebrate. Victory without cost is a fantasy. I focused on restoration, on calming the city, reopening supply routes, reassuring priests, merchants, and citizens that Egypt would endure. A ruler proves herself not when she takes power, but when she steadies what power has shaken. By the time the dust settled, the truth was undeniable. I was back on the throne, not as a ceremonial partner, not as a managed figure, but as the central authority Egypt required. Rome acknowledged it. The court accepted it. The people began, slowly, to believe it. Yet even as stability returned, I knew this chapter was not an ending. Rome had intervened. Rome had invested. Rome would expect returns. My alliance with Caesar had saved my crown, but it had also bound Egypt's fate more tightly to Rome's future. That was the price of survival. And prices, once paid, are never refunded. As I looked out over Alexandria once more, its harbor alive with ships, its streets settling into routine, I allowed myself a single moment of stillness. I had gambled everything, and I had won. But power, I had learned, does not forgive those who mistake victory for safety. The world was already shifting again. Returning to the throne is not the same as reclaiming peace. The crown had come back to my head, but Egypt itself was bruised. Alexandria still bore the marks of tension. Closed shops, wary glances, the quiet counting of losses that follows political upheaval. The people did not cheer loudly. They watched. And watching is far more honest than applause. I understood their restraint. I had returned with Rome at my side. Stability achieved through foreign power always carries a shadow. Even when welcomed, it must prove itself worthy. So I did not rush to celebrate. I worked. The first task was restoration, not of monuments or ceremony, but of confidence. Confidence that taxes would be fair, that grain would be distributed without corruption, that decrees would be enforced consistently, not selectively. I held councils daily, not grand assemblies, but working sessions, long, detailed, exhausting. I questioned administrators until their answers aligned with reality. I replaced officials quietly where necessary. No public purges, no spectacles. Fear produces silence. Order produces endurance. My brother's position had changed irrevocably. He was no longer the focal point of power. The advisors who had ruled through him were removed, some exiled, some absorbed into lesser roles where they could do little harm. I did not seek revenge. Revenge narrows a ruler's future. I sought containment. Ptolemy remained co-ruler in name, but the machinery of government moved through me. That arrangement satisfied tradition while preventing renewed manipulation. It was not kindness. It was geometry. Rome remained present. Caesar's soldiers stayed in Alexandria, officially as peacekeepers. Unofficially, they were reminders of how quickly stability could collapse if Rome withdrew its favor. I accepted this reality without illusion. Egypt had not been conquered, but it had been exposed. The world now understood that internal division invited external dominance. That lesson would guide every decision I made from that day forward. Caesar and I spent long hours discussing governance, not as allies exchanging pleasantries, but as strategists dissecting risks. He was curious about how Egypt had survived so many centuries. I explained that endurance came not from strength alone, but from adaptability. Empires that refused to bend, break. Egypt had bent many times. That bending had allowed it to survive conquerors, dynasties, and droughts. But bending too far invites permanent distortion. Public perception mattered more now than ever. I appeared frequently before the people, not in excess, but in intention. I listened to petitions. I attended religious rites. I ensured grain prices stabilized quickly. Food is politics at its most honest. A full stomach quiets rebellion faster than any decree. Still, rumors traveled faster than relief. In taverns and markets, my name was spoken with curiosity, suspicion, fascination. Some saw me as Egypt's defender. Others saw me as Rome's chosen queen. A few saw both and waited to see which would dominate. I could not control those stories, but I could outlast them. Caesar's presence altered Alexandria in subtle ways. Roman officers walked streets that once belonged solely to Egyptians and Greeks. Latin mixed with Greek in official correspondence. Rome's confidence seeped into the city like a new climate. I watched carefully. Because Rome never simply visits. It studies, adapts, and stays, sometimes without declaring itself permanent. Privately, I reflected on the gamble I had made. I had survived exile. I had reclaimed my throne. I had stabilized Egypt. But survival carries obligations. Caesar expected loyalty. Rome expected reliability. Egypt expected sovereignty. Those expectations were not naturally aligned. Balancing them would define my reign. One night, alone in my chambers, I removed the crown and set it down beside me. Without it, I felt lighter and more vulnerable. That contrast sharpened my understanding of power's true cost. The crown does not protect you. It exposes you. It draws ambition like fire draws oxygen. I began preparing for a future where Caesar would not always be present. Roman politics were volatile. Alliances shifted quickly. Men like Caesar did not die peacefully in their beds. They died violently or were forced aside. Egypt's fate could not be tied to a single Roman. I needed continuity beyond any one alliance. That meant strengthening Egypt internally, administratively, economically, symbolically. I invested in infrastructure. I reaffirmed religious legitimacy. I ensured Egypt's image was that of an ancient, stable power, not a client state waiting to be absorbed. At the same time, I cultivated Roman relationships carefully, never exclusively. Dependence is a form of weakness that masquerades as security. Caesar, for his part, seemed to understand this dance. He did not demand public submission. He respected strength when he saw it. He preferred partners who could stand rather than kneel. That mutual understanding made our alliance functional, not sentimental. And yet, the world outside Egypt did not pause. Rome's civil war was unresolved. Caesar's enemies were regrouping. Egypt's involvement, however indirect, would have consequences. I could feel history accelerating again, pulling me toward another threshold. Because a ruler rarely controls the timing of the next crisis, only her response. As Alexandria settled into a fragile calm, I allowed myself one honest assessment. I had returned stronger than before. Not because I had gained power, but because I had lost everything once and survived. That experience had stripped fear from me in a way no crown ever could. The weight of return was heavier than exile. But it was a weight I now knew how to carry. And somewhere beyond Egypt's borders, forces were already aligning that would test me again. This time not as an exiled queen, but as a sovereign whose choices would echo far beyond the Nile. Power, once reclaimed, does not settle quietly. It shifts the ground beneath everyone who stands near it. Allies become cautious. Enemies become patient. And observers, especially empires, begin to measure how long the new balance will last. Alexandria appeared calm, but it was the calm of a city aware it was being watched. By Rome, by Egypt's priesthood, by merchants whose fortunes depended on uninterrupted trade, by officials who had survived one regime change and wondered whether another would come, and by me. I had learned never to mistake stillness for stability. The streets were orderly. Grain flowed again. Temples resumed their rituals. But beneath that surface, uncertainty lingered like a low tide that had not yet returned. The Roman presence was constant. Caesar's soldiers did not interfere openly, but they did not withdraw. Their camps were reminders, not threats, but facts. Rome had invested in Egypt. Rome would monitor its investment. I ruled deliberately. Each decree was precise, each appointment calculated. I avoided abrupt changes that might invite resistance. Instead, I reinforced continuity, while quietly ensuring that loyalty flowed toward the throne, rather than through intermediaries. I limited the power of individual officials by dispersing authority. No single man would control both grain and money. No governor would remain long enough to build a personal empire. Concentration of power creates rivals. Distribution of responsibility creates dependence. Religion remained central. I understood that Egypt's heart did not beat in palaces, but in temples. So I strengthened the bond between crown and priesthood. I honored festivals. I respected rituals older than my dynasty. I did not pretend to be Egyptian by blood. I presented myself as Egyptian by duty. That distinction mattered. Publicly, I was composed. Privately, I remained vigilant, because I knew that Rome's interest in me was conditional. Caesar had backed me because it served his goals. If circumstances changed, his favor could shift or vanish. I had not forgotten how quickly allies become liabilities. Caesar himself was restless. Victory in Egypt had not satisfied him. His mind remained fixed on Rome, on unfinished conflicts, on rivals who smiled publicly and plotted privately. I watched him closely, not with romance, but with awareness. Men like Caesar are not safe to love. They are safe only to understand. During his stay, I observed how Roman power truly functioned. Not through kingship, not through ritual, but through narrative. Rome justified everything it did by shaping stories, restoring order, defending tradition, protecting allies. These narratives traveled faster than legions and lasted longer than treaties. I began to understand how Egypt would be portrayed if Rome ever chose to dominate it openly. Not as conquest, as correction. That understanding sharpened my resolve to control Egypt's story while I still could. I commissioned coinage bearing my image alone. Not aggressively, not defiantly, simply clearly. Coins are messages that travel farther than any decree. They pass through hands, markets, borders. They teach people who holds power without a single word. My enemies noticed. Rome noticed. I did not apologize. Some nights, Alexandria's harbor lights flickered like uncertain stars. I stood on palace balconies and considered the future, not as destiny, but as terrain. The Mediterranean world was unstable. Rome's civil war would not end cleanly. Whoever emerged victorious would reshape alliances ruthlessly. Egypt would be tested again. The only question was whether I would meet that test prepared. Caesar eventually departed. His departure was orderly, polite, and heavy with implication. Rome never leaves without remembering where it has been. As his ships vanished beyond the horizon, Alexandria exhaled, just slightly. But I did not. I knew that his absence did not mean safety. It meant transition. In the weeks that followed, I focused on independence, not defiance, but capacity. I strengthened Egypt's treasury. I secured grain reserves. I reinforced borders quietly. I maintained diplomatic contact with Rome, without submission. Egypt had to appear reliable but not weak. That balance was delicate and exhausting. Then news arrived that changed the tone of everything. Rome had turned on itself again. Julius Caesar had been assassinated. Not by barbarians, not by enemies at the gates, by senators. Men who claimed they were saving the Republic. History would argue about their motives forever. I did not need to. I understood immediately what this meant. Caesar's death was not just a Roman tragedy. It was an earthquake. The man who had backed my throne was gone. His protection, his authority, his leverage, gone with him. Rome would fracture again. Power would scatter. And Egypt would be reassessed by new hands. Some would see me as Caesar's ally. Others as his legacy's inconvenience. None would ignore me. I did not mourn publicly. A queen's grief must be measured. I acknowledged the loss formally, respectfully. I prepared Egypt for uncertainty. I reviewed every alliance, every dependency, every assumption built on Caesar's survival. Because when a pillar collapses, everything leaning on it must find new support. Or fall. Privately, I felt something closer to recognition than sorrow. I had known Caesar was not permanent. Now the world would discover what came after him. Roman envoys would arrive soon. New alliances would be proposed. Old ones would be questioned. Egypt would once again stand at the crossroads of ambition and necessity. And I would have to choose carefully, because the next Roman I aligned with would shape not just my reign, but my legend. When Julius Caesar died, the world did not pause to mourn. It recalculated. In Rome, grief was performed in public while knives were counted in private. Alliances shifted faster than news could travel. Men who had sworn loyalty rewrote their oaths without shame. Power, suddenly unanchored, drifted, and everyone reached for it. In Egypt, the effect was quieter, but no less severe. Caesar had been more than an ally. He had been a stabilizing force whose name alone discouraged reckless interference. With him gone, Egypt was no longer protected by reputation. It was exposed to reassessment. I felt that exposure immediately. Envoys arrived bearing condolences and questions disguised as courtesy. They asked about Egypt's stability. They asked about my loyalty to Rome. They asked whether Egypt would continue its commitments. Each question was a test, and I answered each with precision. Egypt, I said, was stable. Egypt, I said, honored its agreements. Egypt, I said, expected Rome to do the same. I offered no more and no less. Behind the words, I worked relentlessly. I reviewed Rome's emerging factions. The triumvirs who would soon dominate the Roman stage were not yet settled into their roles. Names rose and fell daily. Mark Antony, Octavian, Lepidus. Each represented a different future. I studied them as I once studied Caesar, not as personalities, but as trajectories. Mark Antony was passion and force, a soldier who commanded loyalty through presence rather than structure. He understood men, not systems. That made him powerful and unpredictable. Octavian was something else entirely. Young, precise, controlled. He did not inspire love. He cultivated inevitability. Where Antony was fire, Octavian was cold iron. Rome would choose between them. Egypt would feel the consequences. I understood something critical. Egypt could not afford to wait passively for Rome to decide its future. Waiting is a form of surrender. So I began to position Egypt as indispensable again, not emotionally, but materially. Grain shipments were stabilized. Finances were made reliable. Egypt became once more a solution rather than a problem. Empires tolerate autonomy when autonomy is useful. At the same time, I took care to separate my image from Caesar's memory. I honored him without becoming defined by him. Too close an association would make me vulnerable to his enemies. Too distant would make me appear ungrateful or unreliable. Balance. Always balance. Within Egypt, I consolidated authority quietly. I reduced the visibility of my brother further, not through humiliation, but through irrelevance. He remained alive, titled, ceremonial. But the machinery of rule no longer acknowledged him as central. I did not need to destroy him. Time was doing that for me. Alexandria watched my every move. Some feared Rome would invade outright. Some believed Egypt would become a Roman province. Some hoped for protection under a new Roman patron. I did not offer reassurance through words. I offered it through continuity. Markets functioned, temples operated, grain flowed. Normalcy is the strongest message a ruler can send. Then came the summons. Mark Antony, now one of Rome's most powerful men, demanded to see me. Not requested, demanded. The location was not Alexandria. It was Tarsus. A Roman city. A Roman stage. A Roman test. I understood the challenge immediately. If I went humbly, I would be judged weak. If I went defiantly, I would be judged dangerous. If I refused, I would be judged hostile. Antony was not Caesar. He would not be persuaded by quiet argument alone. He respected spectacle. So I chose my approach accordingly. I did not travel as a supplicant. I traveled as Egypt. My arrival was deliberate, symbolic, controlled, not indulgent, but unmistakable. I did not imitate Roman displays. I presented something Rome could not replicate. Ancient legitimacy. Wealth shaped by centuries. Confidence born of survival. Antony watched. He always watched. Our meeting was not immediately political. He tested me through conversation, humor, provocation. He wanted to see how I responded to dominance, to charm, to challenge. I responded with clarity. I did not flatter. I did not shrink. I did not compete theatrically. I met force with composure. That unsettled him more than defiance would have. When we finally spoke of power, the conversation sharpened. Antony wanted resources, ships, grain, money. I wanted recognition, security, non-interference. We negotiated as equals, not because Rome and Egypt were equal, but because both of us needed something the other possessed. This was not romance. It was alignment. And yet, something else emerged. Not softness, but resonance. Antony was different from Caesar. Less restrained, more human, more volatile. He did not hide his appetites. That honesty was dangerous and strangely refreshing. I did not trust him completely. But trust is not required for alliance. Understanding is. I returned to Egypt changed, not compromised, but recalibrated. A new Roman power had entered my life. A new set of risks followed. Antony's enemies would watch me. His allies would question me. Rome's future would tighten around us both. And far away, Octavian would begin to sharpen his patience into a weapon. I stood again on Alexandria's shore, watching ships depart, and felt the familiar sensation of history gathering speed. I had survived exile. I had reclaimed my throne. I had navigated Caesar's world. Now I stood at the beginning of something even more dangerous, a partnership that would shape the fate of empires. And empires do not forgive mistakes. When Mark Antony came to Egypt, the air itself seemed to change. Not because of spectacle, though there was plenty, but because he carried Rome's uncertainty with him like a visible flame. He did not arrive cautiously, as Caesar once had. He arrived as a man accustomed to being obeyed, to being admired, to being feared. Alexandria received him with restraint. I did not want my city to look desperate for Roman approval. I wanted it to look confident in its own gravity. So the ceremonies were measured, dignified, unmistakably Egyptian. No imitation of Rome. No apology for difference. Antony noticed. He always noticed. He was not subtle. Where Caesar had asked questions, Antony made declarations. Where Caesar had tested silently, Antony tested aloud, through humor, through bravado, through challenge. He spoke of battles, of loyalty, of Rome's future as if it were already decided. I let him speak. Men like Antony reveal themselves when given space. Privately, we spoke without witnesses. He was direct about what he wanted. Rome needed resources. The eastern provinces needed stabilization. His rivals needed to be outmaneuvered. Egypt could provide what he required, if Egypt stood with him. He did not pretend this was optional. Power rarely does. I responded just as directly. Egypt would support Rome, but not as a servant. My kingdom would not be reduced to a warehouse for Roman wars. Any alliance would recognize Egypt's sovereignty, borders, and internal authority. Antony laughed, not mockingly, not dismissively, with interest. He had not expected resistance dressed in calm. This is the part historians often misunderstand. They speak of passion, of excess, of indulgence. They imagine that the alliance between Antony and me was born of emotion alone. That is comforting fiction. The truth is more unsettling. We aligned because the world demanded alignment. Rome was fracturing. Antony needed legitimacy and resources in the East. I needed a Roman protector strong enough to deter intervention without absorbing Egypt entirely. Our interests overlapped dangerously well. Antony stayed longer than necessary, officially, for negotiations. Unofficially, because he was drawn to the city, and to me. Alexandria did not change him. It reflected him. Its luxuries magnified his appetites. Its openness loosened his discipline. Its distance from Rome allowed him to imagine a different center of gravity. I watched carefully. A ruler who forgets where his power originates invites others to redefine it. Still, the alliance produced results. Egypt regained, territory lost in earlier compromises. Borders were reaffirmed, trade expanded. My authority was publicly recognized by Rome's Eastern Command. For a time, Egypt flourished. The people noticed. Prosperity breeds loyalty faster than propaganda ever could. But prosperity also attracts envy. In Rome, Antony's enemies sharpened their narrative. They painted him as corrupted, distracted, weakened by the East. They painted me as the cause, a foreign queen undermining Roman virtue. It was effective because it was simple. Rome prefers its villains uncomplicated. I understood the danger immediately. Rome does not tolerate divided loyalty. If Antony appeared to serve Egypt more than Rome, he would be destroyed politically, and we would be destroyed with him. So I urged balance. Return to Rome, I advised. Reassert your authority. Do not allow absence to become accusation. Antony listened, but reluctantly. His nature resisted restraint. Behind the scenes, Octavian moved. He said little. He promised stability. He framed himself as Rome's future, disciplined, Roman, inevitable. Compared to Antony's excess, Octavian looked like order. Rome likes order, especially after chaos. The alliance between Antony and me deepened, not just politically, but personally. That closeness strengthened us and endangered us simultaneously. Strengthened us because we trusted each other's intentions. Endangered us because Rome would never trust ours. History would later reduce this complexity to scandal. That reduction is convenient. It removes responsibility from those who shape the conflict and places it on emotion instead of ambition. I was not blind to the risk. I urged Antony to formalize his position, to secure Rome's institutions, not just its legions, to understand that victory in battle does not guarantee victory in narrative. But Antony believed charisma could substitute for structure. That belief would cost him. And Egypt. As tensions grew, I focused on preparation. I secured Egypt's defenses. I strengthened fleets. I ensured grain reserves were untouchable. If conflict came, Egypt would not starve. I also prepared mentally for the possibility that alliance would turn into liability. A ruler must never assume permanence. One evening, as Antony and I stood overlooking the harbor, he spoke of destiny, of the world divided between him and Octavian, of Rome reshaped through victory. I listened, and I wondered whether destiny was something he controlled or something he was chasing. Because there is a difference. I had chosen my side, not out of passion, not out of illusion, but out of calculation. The world was narrowing toward conflict, and neutrality was no longer viable. If Rome was to decide Egypt's fate, then Egypt would be part of that decision, not its victim. Yet even as ships moved and plans formed, I felt the weight of something unspoken pressing closer. Alliances forged under pressure rarely survive peace, and the fire that warms can also consume. The world does not announce when it is about to fracture. It simply stops pretending that unity is possible. By the time Rome formally divided its power, everyone who mattered already knew the truth. Peace was an interval, not a destination. The alliances that had once held the Republic together were exhausted, stretched thin by ambition and fear. Octavian and Antony no longer spoke the same political language. One promised restoration, the other promised dominance. Rome would choose between them, and Egypt would feel the consequences. From Alexandria, the signs were unmistakable. Envoys arrived with sharpened politeness. Letters from Rome grew colder, more precise. Trade routes became political instruments. Every request carried an unspoken condition. I read between every line. A queen who reads only what is written has already lost. Antony returned to the east increasingly defensive. Rome accused him of abandoning tradition, of diluting Roman authority, of allowing foreign influence to dictate policy. That foreign influence was me. I did not need to hear the accusations to know them. I had anticipated them from the moment Antony chose Egypt as his eastern anchor. Rome fears what it cannot fully control, and it fears women who stand outside its narrative even more. Octavian's strategy was surgical. He did not attack Antony's military record directly. That would invite comparison. Instead, he attacked Antony's image, his discipline, his loyalty, his identity as a Roman. He positioned himself as restraint itself. In times of chaos, restraint looks like virtue. Antony underestimated this. He believed victories and loyalty would outweigh perception. He believed Rome would respect strength even when it wore foreign colors. He forgot that Rome defines strength as Roman. Within Egypt, I felt the pressure tighten. Some advisors urged caution. Some urged retreat. Some urged appeasement. Appeasement is always loudest when fear spreads. I listened, but I did not follow. Appeasement would not save Egypt. It would only delay its absorption. I focused instead on unity. I reinforced Egypt's narrative as a sovereign power allied with Rome, not subordinated to it. I emphasized continuity, prosperity, legitimacy. I ensured that Egypt's institutions functioned smoothly regardless of Roman politics. If the storm came, Egypt would face it standing. Antony, however, drifted further from Rome's center. His court in the east grew increasingly symbolic, increasingly personal. Decisions blurred between political necessity and personal loyalty. That blurring alarmed me. Rulers must separate their inner lives from their public actions, or risk collapse. I spoke to Antony candidly. I warned him that Octavian's patience was more dangerous than any army, that Rome's Senate was being conditioned to see Antony as a problem that needed resolution. Antony listened, but with resistance. He did not doubt Octavian's ambition. He doubted Rome's willingness to turn on him fully. That doubt would prove costly. As tensions escalated, Rome demanded clarity. Octavian framed the conflict not as a civil war, but as a defense of Roman identity against foreign manipulation. It was a masterstroke. Wars fought over identity are easier to justify than wars fought over power. The Senate followed predictably. Resolutions passed, declarations sharpened, allegiances hardened. Egypt was no longer a silent partner. It was named. I understood then that war was inevitable, not because Antony and Octavian could not coexist, but because Rome required a singular center again. Empires do not tolerate dual suns. I began preparations openly. Fleets were readied, supply lines secured, command structures clarified. There would be no last-minute scrambling. If Egypt was to fight, it would fight prepared. Still, preparation does not silence doubt. At night, I walked the palace corridors, listening to the echo of my steps. I thought of the choices that had brought me here, each rational, each defensible, each narrowing the path ahead. There were no perfect options left, only necessary ones. The Mediterranean world held its breath. Trade slowed, cities watched the horizon, soldiers waited for orders that would change their lives forever. And in Rome, Octavian spoke of destiny. I did not believe in destiny. I believed in consequence. And I knew that the next chapter of my life would be written not in negotiation, but in conflict, where every mistake would be magnified, and every decision would echo across history. When war finally came, it would not be because I desired it. It would be because there was no space left to avoid it. War announces itself long before the first blow is struck. It appears in language first, in the way letters change tone, in the way silence replaces reassurance, in the way allies begin to speak of preparation instead of peace. By the time armies move, the war has already happened in the minds of those who planned it. I felt that shift before any declaration. Rome no longer asked for Egypt's cooperation. It measured Egypt's resistance. Octavian's strategy matured with frightening clarity. He framed the coming conflict not as Roman against Roman, but as Rome against a foreign threat, against a queen who, he claimed, had ensnared one of Rome's greatest generals and bent him away from duty. This narrative was effective because it simplified blame. Rome did not want to face its own civil fracture again. It wanted an external enemy onto whom it could project its violence and call it unity. I was made that enemy. Antony reacted as a soldier reacts. He prepared for confrontation. He rallied forces. He trusted loyalty and courage. These are powerful tools, but they are incomplete. Octavian did not aim to defeat Antony only on the battlefield. He aimed to defeat him in legitimacy, in perception, in Rome's collective conscience. By the time swords were drawn, Antony would already be framed as the aggressor. I understood this with painful clarity, and I understood something even more dangerous. Rome was preparing not just to defeat Antony, but to erase me. Not physically at first, narratively. Once erased from legitimacy, removal becomes acceptable. Egypt could no longer remain ambiguous. Neutrality had become suspicion. Silence had become accusation. So I stood publicly with Antony. Not because I was blind to the risks, but because withdrawal would have sealed our fate even faster. Rome respects strength. It punishes hesitation. Together, we prepared. Fleets assembled. Commanders were appointed. Logistics were refined. This was not reckless passion. It was methodical necessity. I took command seriously. I did not pretend to be a general, but I did not withdraw into ceremony either. I studied reports. I questioned strategies. I ensured Egypt's resources were used intelligently. War is not won by courage alone. It is won by supply. Still, tension grew between Antony's instincts and the demands of this conflict. He preferred decisive engagement. I favored controlled positioning. He trusted loyalty. I trusted structure. Neither of us was entirely wrong, but the difference mattered. Octavian moved slowly and deliberately. He let Antony appear impatient. He let Rome's Senate grow accustomed to the idea of conflict. He let the narrative harden. By the time war was openly declared, Rome believed it was defending itself. That belief is the most dangerous weapon an empire can wield. In Egypt, the people felt the pressure. Markets whispered, temples prayed, families counted sons. I addressed them not with promises of glory, but with truth. I told them Egypt would defend itself. That sacrifice might come. That survival required resolve. They did not cheer loudly. They nodded. And that was enough. On the eve of departure, I stood with Antony on the deck of a flagship, watching the sea darken beneath the coming night. The Mediterranean looked endless, indifferent. I felt the weight of history pressing close. Every choice had narrowed us here. There was no turning back. Antony spoke of victory. I spoke of endurance. Victory is loud. Endurance is quiet. History remembers both, but only one guarantees survival. As fleets prepared to sail, I allowed myself one final moment of reflection. I had ruled in peace and in crisis. I had negotiated with emperors and priests. I had survived exile, intrigue, and betrayal. Now I stood at the edge of war, not as a pawn, not as a rumor, but as a sovereign whose decisions would shape the fate of Egypt. Whatever came next, I would meet it standing. Because a queen who kneels before fear ceases to be a queen at all. The wind shifted, the sails tightened, the horizon waited. There are moments when the future narrows into a single line. For us, that line ran across the sea. The fleets gathered near Actium, the air thick with anticipation and doubt. Ships creaked under the weight of soldiers, supplies, and expectation. Banners snapped in the wind, carrying symbols of loyalty that would soon be tested. I stood on the deck and watched the horizon as if it might reveal the outcome in advance. It did not. The sea never does. War had already been fought in Rome's words. Now it would be fought in wood, iron, and nerve. Octavian's forces were disciplined, coordinated, relentless. His commanders understood containment, attrition, patience. They did not rush toward glory. They waited for advantage. Antony's fleet was larger, heavier, formidable in presence, but burdened by uncertainty. Supplies were stretched. Morale was uneven. Command was divided between confidence and frustration. I felt it immediately. A fleet moves as one, or it fractures. I had argued for repositioning, for avoiding a decisive engagement until conditions favored us. But pressure mounted, from soldiers, from expectations, from the weight of prolonged stalemate. Antony believed delay weakened resolve. He wanted decision. The sea would decide. The morning of battle was quiet. That quiet was more terrifying than noise. Ships formed lines. Signals were prepared. The wind shifted unpredictably. Every variable mattered. I watched carefully, not just the enemy, but our own formation. Communication lagged. Commanders hesitated. Small misalignments widened. War magnifies hesitation. When engagement began, it was not cinematic. It was confusion. Smoke obscured vision. Signals were missed. Orders overlapped or contradicted. Ships collided unintentionally. Courage surged and stalled in waves. I did not scream. I did not pray aloud. I calculated. Octavian's strategy became clear quickly. He did not seek annihilation. He sought exhaustion. He cut supply routes. He isolated units. He turned patience into pressure. Antony fought bravely, but bravery cannot correct structural imbalance. At a critical moment, the wind shifted. Not dramatically, but decisively. The sea favors no one, but it punishes those who misjudge it. I saw the tide turning, not in a single collapse, but in a realization spreading through the fleet. This battle was slipping beyond control. In that moment, the decision presented itself, not as heroism, but as responsibility. If Egypt's fleet was destroyed completely, there would be no defense left, no leverage, no negotiation possible. This was not the end of war. It was the beginning of survival. I ordered withdrawal, not in panic, in clarity. This decision would be judged harshly by history, but history is written by those who survive to tell it. Our retreat was not clean. Some ships followed, some could not. Some were trapped in confusion and smoke. The cost was heavy. Lives were lost. Confidence was shattered. But Egypt's core strength remained intact. Antony followed, not out of defeat, but loyalty. That choice bound our fates irrevocably. It was a decision made not on the sea, but in the heart. And hearts do not calculate. As we pulled away, the battle continued without us, its outcome inevitable now. Octavian had achieved what he wanted. Not total destruction, final advantage. Silence returned slowly. The sea absorbed the violence as if it had never occurred. I stood on deck and felt something settle inside me. Not despair, but certainty. The war had turned. Now the question was no longer how to win, but how to end without erasing Egypt entirely. The return journey was heavy. No one spoke much. There are no speeches that soften loss. In Alexandria, news arrived before we did. The city prepared for siege, betrayal, panic. I prepared for reckoning. Actium would define me in stories. They would say I fled. They would say I weakened Antony. They would say emotion overcame strategy. They would be wrong. But truth rarely outruns narrative. What mattered was this. Egypt still stood. Its fleet was wounded, not annihilated. Its queen was alive. That meant choices remained. And as long as choices exist, so does power. The final chapters had begun. Defeat does not arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments, through messengers who avoid your eyes, through cities that close their gates too quickly, through allies who begin to speak in conditional language. After Actium, the world did not collapse around us. It narrowed. And narrowing is more dangerous than chaos, because it leaves fewer places to stand. We returned to Egypt not as fugitives, but not as victors either. Alexandria received us with restraint that bordered on fear. The streets were orderly, but quiet. The people did not riot. They waited. Waiting can be an accusation. I understood what they were asking without words. Will you protect us? Antony changed, after Actium. Not immediately, not visibly, but something essential in him cracked. Not his courage, but his certainty. He had been shaped by action, by forward momentum. Now the world seemed to resist him at every step. He paced, he raged, he planned and abandoned plans. I watched with concern, not judgment, because I knew that a leader who doubts himself becomes vulnerable in ways no enemy can exploit more effectively. Rome advanced carefully. Octavian did not rush to Alexandria. He allowed pressure to build. He let news travel faster than armies. He encouraged defections through promises of mercy. Mercy, offered selectively, is a weapon. One by one, allied kings and governors began to abandon Antony. Not dramatically, quietly, efficiently. The map redrew itself while we watched. Inside Egypt, I moved swiftly. I reinforced the city's defenses. I secured remaining loyal commanders. I ensured grain stores were protected. I ordered preparations for siege, not because I believed Alexandria would hold indefinitely, but because readiness creates leverage. A city that prepares to resist forces its enemy to negotiate or escalate. Both outcomes mattered. I also prepared for betrayal. I limited access to critical information. I rotated guards. I assumed that some would switch sides when the opportunity appeared safest. A ruler who expects loyalty blindly invites collapse. Antony proposed bold counterattacks, direct engagement, dramatic reversals, last stands. They were brave ideas. They were also desperate. I urged restraint, not surrender, but calculation. We no longer controlled the narrative. Every aggressive move would reinforce Octavian's portrayal of us as reckless threats. What we needed now was time. Time to divide his coalition. Time to negotiate. Time to preserve Egypt's autonomy. Time was scarce. Octavian's forces closed in steadily. His envoys arrived offering terms, not humiliating, but final. Egypt would submit. Antony would be dealt with. I would be taken to Rome. That last condition mattered most. I read the offer carefully. There were no guarantees, no protections, no dignity. I understood immediately what Rome intended. To be taken to Rome alive was not mercy. It was erasure. I would be paraded as proof of Roman supremacy, reduced from ruler to spectacle. Egypt's sovereignty would be symbolically crushed through my humiliation. That outcome was unacceptable. Not for me. For Egypt. I did not reject the offer immediately. Rejection closes doors. I delayed. I sent messages suggesting consideration. I asked questions. I allowed hope to breathe just long enough to gain information. Meanwhile, I prepared alternatives. Antony's state worsened. Rumors reached him that I had begun negotiations without him. Some of those rumors were deliberately spread by our enemies. Others grew naturally from fear. Trust eroded. War does not just destroy cities. It destroys confidence. One morning, false news reached Antony that I was dead. The effect was catastrophic. In his despair, believing everything lost, he chose an irreversible path. By the time the truth reached him, the damage was done. I rushed to him, not as a queen, but as a woman who had shared decisions, risks, and fate. His final moments were not theatrical. They were human, and painfully quiet. With Antony gone, the war ended in reality, if not yet in ceremony. Octavian entered Alexandria not as a conqueror raging through the streets, but as a man stepping into ownership. His discipline impressed the city. Rome had won. The question now was how much it would take. I met Octavian knowing exactly what he wanted. Not negotiation, not partnership. A symbol. He wanted me alive, visible, defeated. He spoke of mercy, of generosity, of Rome's benevolence. I listened, and I saw the future he offered. I requested time. Time to arrange Egypt's affairs. Time to prepare my children's positions. Time to perform final rites. Octavian agreed. He believed time was his. That belief would be his final miscalculation. In private, I considered every option. Submission would preserve my life, but destroy Egypt's dignity. Resistance would invite massacre. There remained one path that denied Rome its final victory without harming my people. It was not dramatic. It was not vengeful. It was controlled. I secured Egypt's treasury where Rome could not immediately seize it. I arranged the succession. I ensured that Egypt would transition with minimal chaos. I removed myself from Rome's narrative, because a ruler's final act can still be an act of power. When Octavian returned expecting compliance, He found resolution instead. Not defiance, not spectacle. Finality. History would argue endlessly about my choice. But history would not parade me, and Egypt would endure. I prepared myself quietly, not in fear, in clarity, because when all paths lead to loss, choosing the manner of your exit becomes the last form of sovereignty. The night before the end is not loud. That is the lie told by those who have never truly faced it. The last night is quiet, heavy with awareness, precise in its stillness. Every sound feels deliberate. Every breath carries weight. The world does not rush you toward the edge. It waits to see how you will arrive there on your own. I spent that night awake, not pacing, not trembling, thinking. Alexandria slept uneasily. The city had survived conquest before. It would survive again. But something had ended nonetheless. An age, a possibility, a story that would never be continued in the same voice. From my chambers, I could hear distant sounds, guards shifting, doors closing, the faint echo of Roman order settling into Egyptian stone. Rome had not destroyed the city. Rome had absorbed it. That was always its most effective method. Octavian believed the game was over. He believed time belonged to him. Now, that patience would extract compliance. He spoke politely, almost kindly, as one speaks to a valuable object already claimed. He underestimated one thing. A queen who has lost everything except choice is still dangerous. I reviewed my life, not with regret, but with inventory. What had I protected? What had I failed to protect? What would endure after me? Egypt would not vanish with my death. Empires rise and fall, but civilizations persist. The Nile would still flood. The temples would still stand. The people would still endure. What mattered was how Egypt would remember me, and how Rome would use me. I refused to be Rome's ending to my own story. To be displayed in chains, alive but emptied of authority, would have rewritten my entire reign into a single Roman sentence. She was defeated. I would not allow that sentence to stand alone. I prepared carefully, not dramatically, not impulsively. There was dignity even in preparation. I arranged my chambers as if for ritual. I wore garments chosen not for beauty, but for meaning. I surrounded myself with symbols of Egypt, not excess, but continuity. If this was to be my final appearance, it would not be Roman. I sent for my children earlier that day. I did not frighten them with speeches or omens. I spoke to them with clarity, with calm. I reminded them of who they were, not merely by blood, but by responsibility. Children remember tone more than words. I wanted them to remember strength. I also sent final instructions to those I trusted. Nothing elaborate, nothing dramatic, only stability. A ruler's final duty is not to herself. It is to what remains after her. As night deepened, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, but relief. The long tension that had defined my life loosened its grip. The endless calculations, the vigilance, the constant awareness that every choice might be fatal. That burden was ending. What remained was clarity. People will ask whether I hesitated. I did not. Hesitation belongs to those unsure of their reasons. I knew mine. Octavian would wake expecting submission. Instead, he would receive silence. Not rebellion, not spectacle. Silence. And silence, when chosen, speaks louder than defiance. I did not think of Antony in those final hours with despair. I thought of him as part of the road that had led me here. Neither mistake nor destiny, but consequence. We had stood against Rome's narrowing world together. That mattered. The final moment did not feel dramatic. It felt precise. As if I were stepping out of a role I had played fully, without apology. I did not curse Rome. I did not beg the gods. I acknowledged Egypt. That was enough. When dawn approached, the city stirred. Rome prepared for its victory. Egypt prepared for another chapter without its queen. And I, Cleopatra Philopator, daughter of kings, ruler of an ancient land, completed the last act that remained entirely mine. They would say many things, afterward, that I was proud, that I was afraid, that I was in love, that I was defeated. They would say whatever made the story easier to tell. Truth is rarely convenient. What matters is this: Rome did not own my ending, and because of that, it never fully owned Egypt's memory of me. History does not end with a life. It begins again, rewritten, argued over, simplified, distorted. Once a ruler is gone, others rush in to explain her. They do this not to honor truth, but to make the past feel safe. I knew this before I died. I knew Rome would speak loudly in my absence. When Octavian entered my chambers and found what he did not expect, his victory changed shape. He had planned a procession, a symbol, a final punctuation mark to his rise. Instead, he inherited a silence he could not command. Rome would rule Egypt, but it would never fully own my story. That mattered more than survival. They say a ruler's power ends at death. That is incorrect. A ruler's authority may end, but influence does not. Influence lingers in memory, in argument, in the discomfort of those who inherit what they did not fully conquer. Rome took Egypt's governance. It did not take Egypt's soul. In the years that followed, Rome reshaped the land. New laws, new administrators, new narratives. But the Nile still flooded. The temples still whispered prayers older than Latin. The people still spoke my name, sometimes with pride, sometimes with accusation, sometimes with longing. That variety is proof of impact. No one argues about irrelevance. They would call me many things: a seductress, a manipulator, a tragic figure, a villain, a heroine. These labels reveal more about the speaker than about me. Rome needed me to be excessive, so its victory felt moral. Poets needed me to be romantic, so my choices felt personal, not political. Later generations needed me to be dramatic, so history felt entertaining. Few wanted to see the truth, that I ruled in a world that allowed women power only if it could later punish them for using it. I was not perfect. I miscalculated. I trusted when I should not have. I fought battles that could not be won, but I never misunderstood what I was fighting for. Not love, not glory, continuity. Egypt did not survive because of me alone, but it survived with me longer than it might have otherwise. That is not romance. That is governance. Octavian became Augustus. Rome became an empire. Statues were raised. Poems were written. And still, centuries later, you ask who I was. That question itself is my final answer. I was not a footnote in Rome's rise. Rome was a chapter in Egypt's endurance. I was the last ruler of an ancient line, but not the end of an ancient civilization. I did not rule to be liked. I ruled to hold a center while the world fractured. If you judge me harshly, you acknowledge my power. If you admire me, you acknowledge my cost. If you debate me, you acknowledge my permanence. Indifference is the only true defeat, and I was never defeated that way. So remember me not as myth or scandal. Remember me as a ruler who understood the world she lived in and refused to let that world write her final sentence. I chose my ending. Empires hate that. This is where my voice ends. History will continue without it, but not without echo.